There's a quiet shift happening right now that most people either do not see or refuse to talk about, and it is reshaping society from the inside out. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, and it does not announce itself with protests or headlines, but it is one of the most consequential movements of our time. Millions of men have made a decision that once would have been unthinkable, and they have done it calmly, deliberately, and without asking for permission. By the end of this video, you will understand why this shift is permanent, why it is accelerating, and why there is no real path back to the way things used to be. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. If you want to go deeper on protecting yourself financially and learning how to navigate an unstable system, check out Angry's Crypto Academy, where we break down how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto. The Academy is linked in the description, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description as well. What we are witnessing today did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. This is not a sudden rebellion or a temporary reaction to a bad economy or a few difficult years. This is the result of decades of conditioning, messaging, incentives, and social pressure that steadily told men that they were the problem, that they were not needed, and that their presence was either unwanted or suspicious. For a very long time, men were told that their value was conditional, that their instincts were wrong, and that their role in society needed to be corrected, restrained, or supervised. At first, many men tried to adapt. They tried to change their behavior, soften their language, adjust their expectations, and comply with constantly shifting rules. But over time, a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. No matter how much men adjusted, apologized, or stepped back, the message remained the same. You are still the problem. You are still in the way. You are still wrong. Eventually, men stopped arguing and started listening, and what they heard was very clear: go away. So men did exactly that. Not in anger, not in chaos, and not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet resolve. Tens of millions of men stepped back from the workforce, stepped away from traditional social expectations, and stepped out of systems that no longer served them. Many moved into part time work, gig work, remote work, or minimal work. Others reduced their consumption, lowered their expenses, and chose lives that required far less income and far fewer obligations. This was not laziness, and it was not despair. It was calculation. Men realized that the social contract had changed, but no one had bothered to update the terms honestly. They were still expected to produce, provide, and sacrifice, but without respect, appreciation, or stability. Once that realization set in, the logical response was withdrawal. There is a powerful myth that men need society more than society needs men, and that myth is now collapsing under the weight of reality. For generations, men absorbed pressure from every direction. They were expected to work longer hours, take greater risks, and shoulder responsibility quietly, all while being told that they were privileged, replaceable, or obsolete. At the same time, they were warned that any misstep, misunderstanding, or accusation could follow them forever. Courts, institutions, and public opinion increasingly treated men as liabilities rather than contributors. The message became unmistakable. Participation carried risk, but withdrawal offered peace. So men began choosing peace. What is most striking about this shift is not anger, but calm. Men who have walked away often describe a sense of relief rather than bitterness. They discovered that being alone is not the same thing as feeling lonely. Without constant pressure to perform, impress, or prove worth, many men found clarity for the first time in their lives. They simplified their routines, reduced their needs, and focused on what actually brought them satisfaction. They slept better. They worried less. They spent more time on their own interests, their own health, and their own growth. In doing so, they uncovered an uncomfortable truth that society never wanted them to articulate. Much of what they had been chasing was never truly for them in the first place. For decades, men were told that fulfillment came from external validation, from career status, from romantic approval, from being chosen, needed, or praised. But once men stepped away from those expectations, many realized how shallow and transactional those dynamics had become. Relationships were increasingly framed around extraction rather than partnership. Effort flowed in one direction, while accountability flowed in none. Men were expected to give attention, time, energy, and resources, often without clarity, consistency, or reciprocity. When men finally stopped participating in that exchange, the system began to strain. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for many people, because the consequences of men walking away are now impossible to ignore. Entire sectors of the economy were built on the assumption of male overproduction and overconsumption. Housing markets assumed dual incomes with male financial backstopping. Dating and social norms assumed male initiative and spending. Service industries quietly relied on men working more than they needed in order to support lifestyles that were not their own. When men reduced their output and spending, the ripple effects spread quickly. Suddenly, the cost of living felt heavier. Suddenly, independence felt more expensive. Suddenly, the absence of male participation became visible. What we are seeing now is not men demanding recognition or apology. It is men declining to re enter a system that no longer makes sense to them. The same voices that once told men they were not needed are now asking where they went. The same culture that encouraged men to step aside is now struggling with the reality of doing without them. But from the perspective of the men who walked away, nothing about this is confusing. They listened, they adapted, they adjusted their lives accordingly. And in the process, many discovered something they had not experienced before: stability without performance, peace without permission, control without constant negotiation. There is a tendency to frame this shift as a crisis. But for the men involved, it often feels like the opposite. It feels like recovery. For the first time, many men are living within their means, not because they failed, but because they chose not to chase expectations that were never designed to reward them fairly. They are no longer stretching themselves thin to maintain appearances or meet standards that shift whenever they get close. They are no longer tying their self worth to approval that can be withdrawn without warning. Instead, they are building quiet, sustainable lives centered on autonomy and self respect. This does not mean men have rejected responsibility or contribution entirely. It means they are choosing where and how to contribute on their own terms. They are prioritizing self preservation over endless sacrifice, and they are observing patterns instead of believing promises. They are trusting results over rhetoric. And once that shift happens, it is almost impossible to reverse because it is rooted in lived experience rather than ideology. As society continues to change, the gap between expectation and reality grows wider. Systems built on assumptions of male participation now face shortages, strain, and imbalance. Yet, instead of asking why men left, many voices still focus on why men should come back. That question misses the point entirely. Men did not leave to make a statement, they left to protect themselves. And until the underlying conditions change in a meaningful and structural way, there is no incentive for them to return. This is not a phase. It is not a protest. It is a recalibration. Men are no longer volunteering to absorb risk, cost, and blame for systems that do not value them as individuals. They are opting out quietly, efficiently, and permanently. And the longer this continues, the more obvious it becomes that this shift is not driven by anger, but by clarity. Men are not lost. They know exactly where they are. They are simply no longer where they were told they had to be. As we continue, we are going to break down how this happened step by step, why it accelerated so quickly, and what it means for the future of work, relationships, and society as a whole. We will talk about why attempts to shame men back into participation are failing, why economic pressure is not producing the expected response, and why the men who walked away are unlikely to reverse course. This is not about blaming or attacking anyone. It is about understanding a reality that is already here, whether people are comfortable with it or not. To understand why this shift became inevitable, you have to understand how consistently men were told that their natural instincts were wrong. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. From a very young age, boys were taught to doubt themselves, to question their reactions, and to view their own impulses as something that needed correction. Confidence became arrogance, assertiveness became aggression, curiosity became suspicion, even silence became guilt. Over time, this constant reframing trained men to walk on eggshells in every environment, from school to work to social spaces. When you live long enough under rules that change without warning, the safest option eventually becomes disengagement. Men did not stop participating because they could not keep up. They stopped participating because the rules were never stable, and the penalties for getting them wrong were permanent. And the workplace was one of the first places where this fracture became visible. Men were once encouraged to compete, build, and climb. Then the narrative shifted. Merit became secondary to optics. Outcomes mattered less than perceptions. Men found themselves navigating environments where effort did not guarantee advancement and where a single accusation or misunderstanding could erase years of work. At the same time, they were expected to mentor, support, and uplift, often without reciprocal protection. Many men looked at this landscape and made a rational decision: do less, say less, risk less. Eventually, doing less turned into doing only what was necessary, and in many cases, doing nothing beyond that. As men reduced their engagement at work, they also reevaluated their spending. For decades, consumption was framed as success: bigger homes, newer cars, constant upgrades. But once men stepped back from the social incentives tied to those purchases, the illusion faded quickly. Many realized how little they actually needed to live comfortably. A smaller space, fewer possessions, and lower overhead translated directly into freedom. Freedom to work fewer hours, freedom to avoid debt, freedom to walk away from situations that felt unsafe or exploitative. Minimalism was not a trend for these men, it was a strategy. This shift towards simpler living also stripped away the pressure to impress. Without the expectation to perform financially for others, men discovered that much of their previous stress evaporated. They no longer felt compelled to chase promotions that came with diminishing returns. They no longer felt obligated to finance lifestyles that were not aligned with their own values. They stopped viewing money as a tool for approval and started seeing it as a buffer against uncertainty. That psychological shift alone changed everything. Social dynamics changed alongside economic ones. For years, men were told to initiate, pursue, and pay, while also being told that their interest was intrusive or unwanted. That contradiction created a no win scenario: engage and risk public shaming, or disengage and be labeled inadequate. Over time, more men chose disengagement, not because they lacked interest, but because the cost of participation outweighed the benefit. The more men withdrew, the more obvious it became how much social interaction had relied on their effort and resources. What followed was predictable, even if many people refused to acknowledge it. As men stopped asking, paying, and chasing, the environment shifted. Expectations collided with reality. Independence turned out to be more expensive than advertised. Shared burdens resurfaced as personal ones. The absence of male participation was suddenly felt in everyday ways, from housing affordability to lifestyle maintenance. Yet, rather than reflecting on why men opted out, much of the conversation focused on why men needed to return. That framing revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. Men who walked away were not confused or misguided, they had simply recalculated. One of the most revealing aspects of this movement is how quietly it has spread. There were no marches, no manifestos, no centralized leadership. Men observed each other, compared experiences, and reached similar conclusions independently. When patterns repeat across millions of lives, they stop being anecdotes and start being data. Men compared notes about court outcomes, workplace incidents, social interactions, and financial risks. The conclusions were consistent enough that men did not need to be convinced. They only needed permission to trust what they were already seeing. Technology accelerated this process. Online platforms allowed men to share experiences that were once isolated and dismissed. Stories that would have been brushed aside in private conversations became impossible to ignore when repeated thousands of times. This did not radicalize men, it validated them. It confirmed that what they were experiencing was not personal failure, but structural imbalance. Once that realization sets in, it changes how you move through the world. You stop internalizing blame for outcomes that were never under your control. Another key factor in this shift is time. Men began reclaiming it. Without the pressure to constantly produce or pursue, time became abundant. Men slept more, exercised more, read more, learned new skills for their own satisfaction rather than market validation. Some built small projects, others focused on health. Many simply enjoyed the quiet. This reclaimed time reinforced the decision to walk away because once you experience life without constant urgency, it is difficult to justify returning to a state of perpetual stress. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For many men, stepping away revealed how much of their identity had been externally defined. Without constant feedback loops of approval or criticism, they were forced to confront who they were without an audience. That process was not always easy, but it was grounding. Men learned to self validate rather than seek validation. They learned to trust their judgment rather than outsource it. They learned that peace is not something you earn after suffering enough, it is something you protect by setting boundaries. As more men embraced this mindset, the movement gained momentum, not because it was promoted, but because it worked. Men saw tangible improvements in their well being, lower stress, fewer conflicts, greater autonomy. These are powerful incentives. Once men realized they could opt out without catastrophe, the fear that kept them compliant evaporated. And when fear disappears, so does control. At the same time, society continued to send mixed messages. Men were still told they were unnecessary, but also blamed for not showing up. They were criticized for disengaging, but offered no credible assurances that re engagement would be safe or fair. Incentives remained one sided, risks remained asymmetrical. From the perspective of men who had already recalibrated their lives, there was no compelling reason to reverse course. The system had revealed its priorities, and men adjusted accordingly. What makes this moment unique is that it is unfolding alongside economic instability. Rising costs, uncertain markets, and eroding purchasing power have exposed the fragility of many assumptions. In previous generations, men might have absorbed these pressures silently. Today, many simply refuse to. They reduce exposure, lower expenses, and preserve capital. They treat participation as optional rather than mandatory. This approach is not reckless, it is cautious. It prioritizes resilience over appearance, and critics often frame this as selfishness, but that accusation rings hollow when examined closely. Self preservation is not selfish when the environment is hostile. Boundaries are not abandonment when the terms are unreasonable. Men are not refusing to, to contribute to society, they are refusing to be consumed by it. They are choosing sustainability over sacrifice. That distinction matters, even if it makes some people uncomfortable. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men who walked away are thriving in ways that are difficult to measure publicly. Their lives are quieter, less visible, and less performative. They are not broadcasting success because success is no longer defined by external markers. They are content with enough. They are building lives that cannot be easily disrupted by economic swings or social pressure. In a world that thrives on constant engagement, their absence becomes a form of power. This power is not aggressive, it is passive. And that makes it even more destabilizing to systems built on compliance. You cannot shame someone who does not care about approval. You cannot pressure someone who has reduced their needs. You cannot threaten someone who has already accepted walking away. This is why attempts to guilt men back into participation consistently fail. The leverage no longer exists. As the consequences of this shift become more visible, the conversation will intensify. There will be more commentary, more analysis, more attempts to reframe the narrative. Some will try to pathologize men who disengage. Others will attempt to moralize their choices. But beneath all of that noise, the reality remains unchanged. Men are responding rationally to incentives. When incentives change, behavior changes. This is not ideology. It is economics, psychology, and pattern recognition. The future implications of the movement are profound. Labor markets, housing markets, and social structures will all have to adjust. Expectations built on endless male participation will continue to collide with a shrinking supply of it. This adjustment will not be smooth and it will not be evenly distributed, but it will continue because it is driven by individual decisions made in private, reinforced by lived outcomes. Men who have walked away are not waiting for permission to return. They are not holding out for apologies. They are not organizing demands. They are simply living their lives according to new rules that prioritize autonomy and peace. And as long as those lives remain stable and fulfilling, there is no incentive to abandon them. The younger generation of men is watching all of this very carefully, even when they do not talk about it openly. They are observing outcomes rather than listening to slogans, and what they are seeing shapes their choices long before they ever enter adulthood. They see older men who followed every rule still end up exhausted, financially strained, and blamed for outcomes they did not control. They also see men who quietly stepped away, regained stability, time, and peace. That contrast is powerful. It teaches lessons without speeches. Young men learn very quickly when incentives are misaligned, and they adjust before committing themselves to paths that carry disproportionate risk. This is why the trend is not slowing down. It is being inherited. For a long time, society relied on the assumption that men would always step in to absorb pressure when systems strained. Economic downturns, social instability, rising costs, men were expected to work longer, sacrifice more, and hold everything together. That assumption no longer holds. When men disengage early, before building obligations they cannot escape, the leverage disappears. A young man who chooses minimal debt, low expenses, and flexible income has very little to lose by opting out. He does not need to rebel. He simply never fully opts in. Education was once framed as the gateway to opportunity, but for many men, it became another example of asymmetrical risk. Rising costs, uncertain returns, and environments that increasingly treated male students as problems rather than participants made the calculation straightforward. Many men now pursue skills directly, bypassing traditional pipelines entirely. Others choose work that prioritizes autonomy over prestige. They are not unmotivated. They are selectively motivated. They invest effort where it produces control rather than exposure. This selective engagement is often misinterpreted as apathy, but it is anything but. It is strategic restraint. Men are conserving energy, attention, and resources for things that genuinely improve their lives. They are less interested in proving themselves to institutions that offer no reciprocal loyalty. They are less willing to gamble their futures on systems that punish mistakes harshly while rewarding compliance modestly. Once this mindset takes hold, it spreads naturally because it is grounded in observable outcomes rather than theory. Another factor driving this movement is the erosion of trust. Trust is the foundation of participation. When trust collapses, participation follows. Many men no longer trust that effort will be rewarded fairly, that rules will be applied consistently, or that intentions will be interpreted generously. In environments where trust is low, withdrawal is not cynicism, it is prudence. Men are responding to signals, not narratives, and the signals have been clear for a long time. What makes this especially difficult for institutions to address is that there is no single grievance to fix. This is not about one policy, one law, or one cultural moment. It is about accumulated experiences that collectively changed behavior. You cannot reverse that with a slogan or a campaign. You cannot guilt people into trust. Trust has to be rebuilt slowly, consistently, and credibly. And that requires accountability, something many systems struggle to offer. Meanwhile, men who have stepped back continue to refine their lives. They become more efficient, more self sufficient, and more resilient. They learn to live with less noise and fewer dependencies. This makes them even harder to pull back into systems that demand constant engagement. Each year spent outside reinforces the decision. Each month of stability without stress confirms it. The longer this continues, the more entrenched it becomes. There is also a cultural element that rarely gets discussed openly. Masculinity itself has been redefined in ways that left many men without a clear or respected role. Traditional expectations were dismantled, but nothing coherent replaced them. Men were told what not to be, but not what they could be. In that vacuum, many chose to define masculinity for themselves rather than accept external definitions that felt hostile or contradictory. Walking away became not just an economic choice, but an identity choice. This self defined masculinity prioritizes competence, autonomy, and self respect over validation. It values results over recognition. It is quiet, disciplined, and inwardly anchored. It does not seek approval because it does not need it. And because it is not performative, it often goes unnoticed until its absence creates problems elsewhere. By the time its impact is felt, it is already too late to reverse easily. As more men adopt this orientation, social pressure loses effectiveness. Shame requires an audience that cares. Fear requires dependence. Guilt requires shared values. When men disengage from systems that wield those tools, the tools stop working. This is why messaging that once would have compelled compliance now falls flat. Men are no longer emotionally invested in narratives that frame them as either saviors or villains. They are simply opting out of the story entirely. Economic pressure, which many assumed would force men back into participation, has had the opposite effect for many. Rising costs have accelerated minimalism rather than consumption. Instead of working more to maintain previous lifestyles, men are choosing to need less. They downsize, they relocate, they adapt. This flexibility undermines the assumption that financial stress will drive re engagement. When you can survive comfortably on less, pressure loses its force. This adaptability also explains why predictions about collapse often miss the mark when it comes to men who have already stepped away. These men are not fragile participants dependent on constant income and external validation. They are resilient observers who have already adjusted to instability. While others struggle to maintain appearances, these men have long since abandoned them. That gives them an advantage that is difficult to quantify but easy to feel. There is a growing divide between those who expect rescue and those who expect nothing. Men who walked away expect nothing. That expectation frees them from disappointment and manipulation. It also makes them immune to appeals that rely on obligation rather than incentive. You cannot demand sacrifice from someone who has already chosen self preservation. You cannot invoke duty when the contract that defined that duty has been voided by experience. As this divide widens, frustration grows among those who still believe participation should be automatic. They view disengagement as defiance rather than adaptation. But from the perspective of the men involved, there is no rebellion here. There is only alignment between behavior and reality. Men are doing what makes sense given the conditions they face. That is not ideology, that is survival logic. The most telling sign that this movement is here to stay is how little effort men put into defending it. They do not argue, they do not justify, they simply live differently. That quiet confidence speaks louder than any manifesto. It communicates that the decision has already been made and does not require consensus. And because it is decentralized, it cannot be negotiated with or dismantled easily. As we move forward, the consequences of this shift will continue to unfold in subtle but significant ways. Labor shortages will persist. Social expectations will clash with behavior. Economic models built on outdated assumptions will struggle. And through it all, men who have stepped away will continue to live their lives largely unaffected by the noise. They will watch, adapt, and adjust as needed without rushing back into systems that have not earned their trust. Attempts to reverse this trend have followed a predictable pattern, and that pattern reveals why they fail. First comes denial, the insistence that nothing fundamental has changed and that participation will naturally rebound. Then comes moral pressure, framing disengagement as irresponsible or immature. When that fails, urgency is introduced, warnings about economic collapse, social breakdown, or long term consequences meant to scare men back into compliance. But none of these approaches address the core issue, which is credibility. Men do not leave because they misunderstand the stakes, they leave because they understand them all too well. You cannot motivate someone with threats they have already accepted. When institutions attempt to entice men back with superficial incentives, the disconnect becomes even clearer. Promises of inclusion, recognition, or future opportunity ring hollow to men who have already seen how easily those promises dissolve under pressure. Men are pattern oriented. They remember outcomes, not intentions. When systems demonstrate inconsistency, selective enforcement, or asymmetric accountability, trust erodes permanently. No amount of messaging can undo lived experience. This is why campaigns aimed at restoring participation feel performative rather than persuasive. They treat the symptom while ignoring the cause. The reality is that re engagement would require structural change, not rhetorical change. It would require environments where effort reliably produces security, where rules are applied consistently, and where risk is shared rather than concentrated. It would require accountability mechanisms that protect participation rather than punish it. These changes are difficult because they force institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about how incentives have been misaligned for decades. It is easier to ask men to return than to rebuild systems that deserve their return. Another reason these efforts fail is that many men no longer define success in ways that institutions recognize. When success shifts from status to stability, from visibility to peace, traditional incentives lose power. Men who value time over titles are not motivated by prestige. Men who prioritize autonomy are not swayed by hierarchy. Men who have learned to live within their means are not tempted by marginal financial gains that come with disproportionate stress. This value shift makes re engagement a harder sell than many anticipate. There is also a generational feedback loop at work. As older men step away and younger men observe the benefits, disengagement becomes normalized rather than stigmatized. What was once framed as failure is now understood as choice. This reframing matters because it removes shame from the equation. Shame is a powerful motivator only when people accept its legitimacy. Once men reject the premise, shame loses its grip. That cultural shift is subtle but decisive. Media narratives often lag behind reality, and this is no exception. Coverage still assumes that disengagement is temporary or driven by external shocks rather than internal recalibration. This misinterpretation leads to solutions that miss the mark. Policies designed to push participation without restoring trust simply accelerate withdrawal. Men respond to pressure by reducing exposure, not by increasing compliance. This is rational behavior in environments perceived as unstable or hostile. Another overlooked factor is that many men who have walked away are not isolated or disconnected. They maintain networks, friendships, and communities that operate outside traditional structures. These connections provide support without entanglement. They offer belonging without obligation. This alternative social fabric reduces reliance on institutions that once monopolized community and identity. When people have viable alternatives, coercion loses effectiveness. Economic volatility has further reinforced this mindset. In uncertain times, flexibility becomes more valuable than scale. Men who have minimized commitments can pivot quickly. They can relocate, change work, or adjust spending without cascading consequences. This adaptability is a form of resilience that centralized systems struggle to replicate. While others scramble to maintain stability through expansion or leverage, these men maintain it through simplicity. The longer this contrast persists, the more persuasive it becomes. Men see which strategies weather turbulence and which collapse under strain. They adjust accordingly. This is not ideological alignment, it is adaptive behavior. People do what works. When walking away works better than leaning in, walking away becomes the default. It is important to understand that this movement is not driven by resentment, even if resentment exists at the margins. Its core is disengagement, not opposition. Men are not trying to dismantle systems, they are simply declining to participate in them. That distinction matters because it changes how power operates. Systems can respond to protest, they struggle to respond to absence. Absence is difficult to negotiate with because it does not present demands. There is no list of concessions that guarantees return. Each man weighs his own costs and benefits privately. This decentralization makes the movement durable. It cannot be co opted or redirected easily. It exists wherever individuals make similar calculations under similar conditions. As pressure mounts, some voices call for renewed appeals to duty, sacrifice, or legacy. But these appeals assume a shared narrative that no longer exists. Duty requires trust in the institution that defines it. Sacrifice requires confidence that it will be honored. Legacy requires belief in continuity. When those foundations erode, the concepts lose traction. Men are not rejecting these values out of selfishness. They are rejecting the structures that hollowed them out. This creates a paradox that many commentators struggle to articulate. Society needs participation, but participation cannot be forced sustainably. It must be earned, and earning it requires humility, accountability, and reform. These are challenging because they involve relinquishing control rather than asserting it. Yet without them, the trend will continue. Men who have recalibrated their lives are not hostile to society. They are simply no longer invested in saving systems that refuse to save themselves. They are open to cooperation, but only under conditions that respect their autonomy and recognize their risk. Until those conditions exist, disengagement remains the rational choice. As we move deeper into this transformation, the question is not whether men will return, but whether institutions will adapt. That adaptation will require confronting uncomfortable realities about incentive structures, accountability gaps, and cultural narratives that alienated the very people they relied on. Avoiding that reckoning only accelerates withdrawal. If adaptation does not occur, the long term consequences will not arrive all at once, but in layers that build quietly over time. The first layer is already visible in labor participation and productivity. When large numbers of men reduce hours, opt out of advancement, or leave entire sectors, output declines even if employment statistics attempt to obscure it. Systems designed around surplus effort begin to strain when that surplus disappears. Work that once relied on informal overperformance now requires formal incentives, higher costs, or automation. This increases expenses across the board and accelerates inequality between those who can adapt and those who cannot. The second layer appears in social infrastructure. Communities once held together by informal male contribution begin to weaken. This is not about hero narratives or nostalgia, it is about maintenance. Many systems functioned because men quietly filled gaps, solved problems, and absorbed inconvenience without recognition. When that stops, the gaps remain visible. Responsibility shifts from informal actors to formal systems, which are slower, more expensive, and less flexible. This transition creates friction that compounds over time. The third layer is psychological. As disengagement normalizes, expectations reset. Younger men no longer internalize guilt for opting out. They see disengagement as prudent rather than deviant. This changes how social pressure operates. Messages that once relied on moral obligation no longer resonate. When obligation is removed from the equation, only incentive remains. And when incentives are misaligned, participation continues to decline. Economic models struggle most with this shift because they assume rational actors will always seek maximization within the system. What they fail to account for is the decision to minimize exposure instead. Men who have stepped away are not optimizing within existing frameworks, they are redefining the framework entirely. They choose stability over growth, resilience over scale, and autonomy over integration. These choices undermine projections built on perpetual expansion. As disengagement persists, attempts to reframe the narrative grow more urgent. Some voices argue that men owe society participation, regardless of conditions. Others claim that disengagement is a moral failure that must be corrected. But obligation without reciprocity is not sustainable. Men understand that intuitively. They have lived through enough cycles of promise and disappointment to recognize when appeals lack substance. Without credible reform, these narratives function more as expressions of frustration than solutions. The most difficult reality for institutions to confront is that men who walked away are not suffering in the way expected. Many are doing better than before. They are healthier, calmer, and more financially stable relative to their needs. This undermines the assumption that disengagement is self destructive. When evidence contradicts the warning loses authority. This is why the movement spreads quietly rather than loudly. Success does not require validation. Another consequence of sustained disengagement is the redefinition of relationships. Men who prioritize autonomy approach connection differently. They are more selective, less reactive, and less willing to tolerate imbalance. They value compatibility over intensity and peace over drama. This changes the dynamics of interaction across the board. Expectations built on constant pursuit and performance lose their footing. Relationships become optional rather than central, chosen rather than assumed. This shift does not eliminate connection, it changes its terms. Men form bonds around shared interest, mutual respect, and low obligation. These relationships are lighter, more flexible, and less prone to conflict because they are not burdened by unspoken expectations. This model contrasts sharply with traditional structures that rely on pressure, sacrifice, and endurance. As more men experience the benefits of this approach, it reinforces disengagement from older models. Institutions face a similar challenge. To adapt, they would need to redesign participation around choice rather than obligation. That means reducing risk, increasing transparency, and sharing accountability. It means accepting that participation must be earned repeatedly rather than assumed indefinitely. This is a profound shift in mindset, and it is uncomfortable because it requires relinquishing control. Control has been the default response to uncertainty. When participation declines, the instinct is to apply pressure. But pressure accelerates withdrawal when trust is low. Men respond to coercion by reducing dependence. They simplify, detach, and insulate themselves. This response is not emotional, it is strategic, and it is highly effective. As disengagement continues, a new equilibrium begins to form. Systems adjust downward, expectations recalibrate, scarcity replaces abundance in areas once taken for granted. This adjustment is not catastrophic, but it is disruptive. It forces a reevaluation of what is sustainable and what is not. Those who adapt early fare better than those who cling to outdated assumptions. One of the most revealing aspects of this transition is how invisible it can be to those not directly affected. Because disengagement is quiet, it is often mistaken for apathy or temporary retreat, but absence accumulates. When enough people step back, the impact becomes undeniable. By the time it is widely acknowledged, reversing it requires far more effort than preventing it would have. Men who have stepped away are often accused of indifference toward broader outcomes. But indifference is not the same as refusal. They are not unconcerned, they are unconvinced. They have seen too many cycles where responsibility flowed in one direction and blame followed regardless. Their disengagement is a form of risk management, not apathy. This perspective reframes the entire conversation. The issue is not motivation, it is trust. It is not entitlement, it is alignment. Men are willing to contribute when contribution makes sense. When it does not, they conserve resources. This behavior is consistent across cultures and eras. What is different now is the scale and visibility. As trust erodes, rebuilding it becomes exponentially harder. Each failed attempt reinforces skepticism. Each unfulfilled promise validates withdrawal. This feedback loop continues until participation stabilizes at a lower level that reflects actual incentives rather than assumed norms. That level may be sufficient for some systems, but it will not support the expectations built during periods of over participation. Ignoring this reality does not make it disappear. It simply delays adaptation, and delay increases cost. The longer systems resist change, the more abrupt and painful adjustment becomes. This is not a warning, it is an observation grounded in pattern recognition. Men who have recalibrated their lives understand this intuitively. They do not expect systems to change quickly, they plan accordingly. They reduce exposure, maintain flexibility, and prioritize self preservation. This approach allows them to navigate instability without panic. It also makes them less susceptible to narratives designed to provoke urgency or fear. As this transformation continues, the gap between perception and reality will narrow. Outcomes will speak louder than commentary. Participation will reflect incentives rather than rhetoric. And the men who chose to step away will continue to live quietly, adaptively, and on their own terms. Genuine reform, if it were ever to happen, would require a level of honesty that many institutions have spent decades avoiding. It would require admitting that participation was extracted rather than earned, that responsibility was distributed unevenly, and that accountability often flowed in only one direction. Reform would mean redesigning systems so that effort reliably leads to security instead of exposure, where mistakes are proportional rather than catastrophic, and where contribution is met with protection rather than suspicion. These are not cosmetic changes. They strike at the core of how modern structures operate, which is why they are resisted so strongly. One of the greatest barriers to reform is the belief that people will always return once conditions become difficult enough. This assumption has shaped policy, culture, and messaging for years. It rests on the idea that discomfort produces compliance. But what we are seeing now is the opposite. Discomfort is producing disengagement, not obedience. Men are not responding to pressure by leaning in. They are responding by stepping back further, reducing needs, and insulating themselves from systems that amplify risk. This inversion breaks traditional leverage mechanisms. Reform would also require acknowledging that trust, once broken, cannot be demanded back on schedule. Trust is rebuilt slowly through consistent behavior over time. It cannot be accelerated through announcements or campaigns. For men who have already stepped away, promises of future improvement carry little weight unless accompanied by immediate, observable change. And even then, skepticism remains. Once someone has reorganized their life around independence, reintegration must offer something truly compelling to justify the disruption. Another uncomfortable requirement of reform is shared vulnerability. Systems that demand sacrifice without sharing risk inevitably lose participants. Men are acutely aware of asymmetry because they have lived it. They know what it means to be accountable without authority, responsible without protection, and essential without appreciation. Reform would require redistributing risk in a way that feels tangible rather than symbolic. That kind of redistribution is politically and culturally difficult because it challenges entrenched power structures. There is also the issue of narrative. For decades, narratives about men oscillated between dismissal and condemnation. Men were told they were unnecessary, then blamed for absence. Reform would require abandoning those narratives entirely and replacing them with something grounded in reality rather than ideology. It would require acknowledging that men are neither villains nor utilities, but individuals responding rationally to incentives. This reframing threatens identities built around moral certainty, which is why it encounters resistance even when evidence supports it. Because reform is so difficult, many men do not expect it to happen. They are not waiting for systems to improve. They are planning for a future where disengagement remains the norm. This planning takes many forms. Some men build portable skill sets that allow them to move easily between opportunities. Others prioritize savings and low overhead. Some form small, decentralized networks that provide support without bureaucracy. These strategies reflect a fundamental shift in how men relate to uncertainty. This future orientation further entrenches disengagement. When you plan your life around autonomy, reintegration becomes increasingly unattractive. The opportunity cost grows. Returning to high obligation systems would require sacrificing flexibility, peace, and control. Unless the benefits are extraordinary, the trade off does not make sense. This calculus is not emotional, it is practical. Men have learned to evaluate systems based on outcomes rather than promises. As this mindset spreads, the cultural gap widens. Those who still believe in automatic participation struggle to understand why appeals fall flat. They interpret refusal as defiance rather than adaptation. This misunderstanding fuels frustration, which then feeds harsher rhetoric. But harsher rhetoric only accelerates withdrawal. Men who feel misunderstood or mischaracterized respond by disengaging further. The feedback loop continues. Another consequence of sustained disengagement is the erosion of informal mentorship. In the past, many men passed knowledge, skills, and guidance through workplaces, communities, and social institutions. As men withdraw, these informal channels weaken. This affects not only men, but anyone who relied on that quiet transmission of experience. Rebuilding it formally is costly and inefficient, yet its absence is rarely acknowledged until gaps become severe. At the same time, men who disengage often create alternative forms of mentorship within smaller, trusted circles. These relationships are selective and low visibility, but highly effective. They operate outside mainstream institutions, which limits their reach but increases their resilience. This parallel structure further reduces dependence on traditional systems and reinforces disengagement. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this movement is that it does not require ideological agreement. Men with very different beliefs arrive at similar conclusions because they are responding to similar incentives. This convergence makes the trend robust. It does not depend on leadership, messaging, or coordination. It depends on lived experience. And lived experience is difficult to counter with abstract arguments. As time passes, disengagement becomes less controversial simply because it becomes normal. What once drew attention fades into the background. Men quietly living minimal, autonomous lives do not generate headlines, but their absence reshapes everything from consumer markets to political assumptions. Systems built on participation discover too late that participation was never guaranteed. This normalization also affects how men view themselves. Identity shifts from what one provides to what one preserves. Success becomes measured by stability rather than status. This internal metric is far less susceptible to external manipulation. It does not rise and fall with approval or condemnation. It remains steady even as conditions change. That steadiness is a powerful incentive to maintain disengagement. Those who hope for a reversal often underestimate how deeply this identity shift runs. It is not a tactic, it is a worldview adjustment. Men no longer see themselves as obligated actors in someone else's narrative. They see themselves as stewards of their own time, energy, and resources. That perspective changes every decision downstream. And if reform does not occur, society will continue to adjust to lower participation. This adjustment will be uneven and at times uncomfortable. Some systems will shrink, others will automate. Expectations will recalibrate downward. None of this requires catastrophe. It requires acceptance of a new baseline. Resistance to that acceptance creates more disruption than the baseline itself. Men who have stepped away are prepared for this adjustment. They have already adapted their lives accordingly. They do not expect rescue. They do not expect stability from external systems. They expect volatility and plan around it. This expectation gap between those who rely on systems and those who do not will continue to widen. As this rebalancing continues, what becomes increasingly clear is that society is not collapsing in the way many fear, but it is shedding illusions it can no longer afford to maintain. For a long time, participation was assumed rather than negotiated, extracted rather than earned. Men were expected to fill gaps indefinitely, absorb pressure silently, and stabilize systems that offered diminishing returns. What we are seeing now is not the destruction of society, but the exposure of how much it relied on invisible labor and unreciprocated responsibility. When that labor withdraws, the strain reveals where assumptions replaced sustainability. Cultural cohesion weakens not because men disengage, but because cohesion was built on uneven foundations. True cohesion requires mutual benefit, shared risk, and reciprocal respect. When those elements erode, cohesion becomes performative rather than functional. Men who have stepped away are not rejecting community itself. They are rejecting participation in structures that demand loyalty without protection. This distinction is critical because it explains why many men still form strong bonds, just outside traditional frameworks. They are not antisocial, they are selectively social. Future generations will grow up with this reality as their baseline. They will not remember a time when automatic participation was unquestioned. They will not internalize guilt for opting out of systems that feel misaligned. Instead, they will assess participation the way previous generations assessed employment offers, by weighing costs against benefits. This normalization changes everything. It removes moral framing from decisions that are fundamentally practical. It teaches young men to prioritize sustainability over approval from the very beginning. Attempts to restore previous norms often fail because they aim backward instead of forward. They assume that reintroducing old incentives or pressures will produce old behaviors. But the context has changed too much. Information travels faster. Experiences are shared openly. Patterns are recognized earlier. Once people see how systems operate in practice rather than theory, nostalgia loses its power. You cannot convince someone to re-enlist in a story they have already seen end poorly. This does not mean cooperation is impossible. It means cooperation must be redesigned. Any future model that hopes to regain male participation must start from a different premise. Participation must be optional, not assumed. Contribution must be protected, not exploited. Risk must be shared, not concentrated. These principles are not radical, they are foundational. The fact that they feel radical now speaks to how far structures drifted from balance. Many men believe this redesign is unlikely, not because it is undesirable, but because it threatens entrenched interests. Systems built on asymmetry rarely reform themselves willingly. They rely on pressure, urgency, and moral framing to maintain compliance. When those tools stop working, adaptation becomes unavoidable. But it is often delayed until costs are undeniable. Men who have stepped away are not waiting for that moment. They are already living as if it may never come. From the outside, this can look like detachment. From the inside, it feels like clarity. Men who disengage often describe a sense of alignment they never experienced before. Their actions match their values. Their effort matches their reward. Their risks are calculated rather than imposed. This alignment reduces internal conflict, which in turn reduces the need for external validation. When that happens, pressure loses its grip. The broader implications of the shift will continue to unfold over decades, not years. Economic models will adjust. Social expectations will recalibrate. New forms of cooperation will emerge while others fade. Through it all, men who have chosen autonomy will remain adaptable. They will engage where it makes sense and withdraw where it does not. They will treat participation as a choice rather than an obligation. This is why attempts to shame, scare, or guilt men back into previous roles consistently fail. Those tools rely on dependence. Men who have reduced their dependence cannot be moved by them. The leverage is gone. What remains is negotiation, and negotiation requires respect. Until that respect is embedded structurally rather than rhetorically, disengagement remains the rational path. Some will frame this as a loss, and in some ways it is. It is the loss of assumptions that no longer hold. It is the loss of certainty built on unequal exchange. But it is also a gain. It forces honesty. It forces systems to justify themselves. It forces a conversation about sustainability that was long overdue. Men walking away did not create these problems, they revealed them. What happens next depends less on the men who left and more on the systems that remain. Men have already adapted, they have already recalibrated their expectations. They are prepared for a future defined by volatility rather than stability. They are not waiting to be convinced. They are waiting to see what proves itself worthy of engagement. Until then, they will continue to live quietly, deliberately, and on their own terms. They will focus on self preservation, personal fulfillment, and maintaining control over their time and resources. They will trust observable reality over promises. They will choose peace over performance, and they will not apologize for it. Before we wrap up, I want to know what you think about everything we talked about today. Do you agree with this shift? Do you see it happening around you, and how do you think it plays out from here? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because these conversations matter even when they are uncomfortable. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.